There are drivers who win championships, and then there are drivers who win hearts. In Elio de Angelis, there was a man who did both, quietly, gracefully, and with a kind of dignity that feels almost alien to modern motorsport. A driver who could, had the cards fallen differently, have been a famous pianist, playing at concert halls around the world. Instead, he proved himself to be a spirited racer whose desire to win belied his glamorous upbringing. He was a fierce but fair competitor who was able to extract the maximum from whichever car he was given. Born in Rome in 1958, lost far too soon in 1986. A driver remembered not just for his speed, but for his soul. He has been called Formula One's last gentleman player, and when you know his story, you'll understand why. Elio grew up in a world of privilege. His father, Giulio, was a wealthy real estate developer in Rome who had briefly dabbled in racing cars before turning to powerboat racing after Elio's grandfather had refused to allow the young man to face danger. Giulio would become powerboat world champion 3 times in the 1960s. His father's success, unsurprisingly, kindled a flame for racing in young Elio, but unlike others, his father's success as a builder meant that he had the backing to take his first steps in karting, moving to cars and climbing the ladder, culminating in winning the 1977 Italian Formula 3 Championship, as well as finding some success in the European Formula 3 Championship. Elio wasn't playing at racing, he was serious. In 1978, he drove in the European Formula 2 Championship, but the bulk of his racing was in the Aurora AFX British Formula 1 Championship, where he competed using a Formula 2 car. He also took victory at the prestigious Monaco Formula 3 race, despite driving an outdated 1977 car. Success which was more than enough to bring him to the attention of the Formula 1 community. One of those most interested was Enzo Ferrari, who saw a talent in De Angelis which made him an attractive proposition. Early in the season, De Angelis tested the Ferrari 312 T3 at Fiorano, performing well, and a pre-contract was signed for De Angelis to replace Gilles Villeneuve, who had proved to be a disappointment in his first full season at Maranello. 2 things prevented De Angelis from replacing the Canadian. Firstly, Ferrari wanted De Angelis to drive half a season for Surtees before joining Ferrari. The Surtees car was less than brilliant, and De Angelis didn't believe that rattling around at the back of the grid would serve his long-term interests. Then, Villeneuve won the 1978 Canadian Grand Prix, saving his Ferrari career. De Angelis was no longer on the radar. Instead, after briefly having a contract with Tyrrell, which the English team reneged on, De Angelis signed to drive for Shadow, with Giulio De Angelis providing the funds for half a season of racing in 1979. Elio made his debut in Formula 1 as teammate to Jan Lammers. The Dutch driver's sponsor Samson had provided most of the funds for Shadow to operate in 1979. However, De Angelis soon proved to be the quicker driver, out-qualifying and out-racing his teammate. He came close to scoring points in his very first race, finishing 7th in Argentina, and ended the season by securing his first points in the final race at Watkins Glen, a race which was run in mostly soaking conditions. De Angelis raced to a remarkable 4th place, as more experienced drivers seemed unable to cope with the changeable conditions. His performance in the first half of the season had been enough to convince Shadow that the Italian would not need to find funds to continue with the team, and De Angelis was signed to a multi-year contract. The way he outperformed the car was eye-catching, and one of those whose eyes was caught was Colin Chapman. The Lotus boss was looking to replace Carlos Reutemann for the 1980 season. The Argentinian had left the team after it had endured a disastrous season. Even so, Lotus was still very much the British Ferrari, and with 3 Drivers' World Championships under its belt in the 1970s, was still an attractive seat for any driver on the grid. Looking to find a new teammate for 1978 World Champion Mario Andretti, Chapman wanted to compare the young drivers at his disposal to determine who would be the best fit. Along with De Angelis, the team tested Nigel Mansell, Eddie Cheever, and De Angelis' shadow teammate Jan Lammers. There was no competition. De Angelis lapped the Paul Ricard circuit more than a full second ahead of all the other contenders, and it was an easy decision for Chapman to sign him for a race seat in 1980. However, De Angelis' long-term contract with Shadow was a problem, and in the end, an agreement was reached for De Angelis to pay Don Nichols in order to terminate the contract and release him so that he could sign for Lotus. Team Lotus in 1980 wasn't in a great place. 1979 had seen the team introduce the complex Lotus 80, which was too advanced even for its builders. Reutemann had flat out refused to drive it, and whilst Andretti quietly continued with development work, the team rolled out the aging Lotus 79 for its drivers to race. Outclassed by newer cars, the season had been a disaster for the team. The new Lotus 81 was a lot more conventional, and initially signs were good. In his first race for the team, De Angelis outqualified Andretti and put the car fifth on the grid, although an early suspension failure put him out of the race. Next time out in Brazil, De Angelis raced from seventh on the grid to clinch second place and his first trip to the Formula One podium. Across the season, De Angelis would outqualify Andretti 8-6 and claimed 13 points in total, good enough for seventh place in the championship. After failing to compete with his new teammate, Andretti left the team for Alfa Romeo, and Nigel Mansell would step up into the number 2 seat for 1981, after driving a third Lotus in 3 races at the tail end of the 1980 season. At just 22 years of age, De Angelis was now team leader at Lotus, and on the basis of his performance in 1980, the team were expecting great things. New regulations had been introduced to reduce the impact of ground effects and to level the playing field. The rubber skirts which formed the seal between the car and the track were banned, and a new minimum ground clearance between the car's chassis and ground was set at 6 centimetres. The easy solution adopted by most teams at the start of the season was just to remove the skirts from their 1980 cars and start from there. Colin Chapman, however, was not one for the easy solutions, and he once more produced a groundbreaking new car which threatened to blow the competition away. The Lotus 88 used a twin chassis design, with the central part of the car comprising the cockpit, engine, gearbox, suspension and cooling systems. The outer section included most of the aerodynamic body of the car, and it was this which was suspended from the central chassis on gas dampers. These were easy to compress but very slow to rebound. Once the car was up to any sort of speed, the outer chassis would overcome the resistance of the dampers thanks to the downforce it was generating, which would then lower its skirts onto the track, recreating the ground effects which had been lost as a result of the new regulations. Both competitors and the FIA took a dim view of the new car though, and the latter immediately banned it, claiming it failed to comply with the movable aerodynamics law in place at the time. The other teams demanded the FIA ban it because no car on the grid would be able to get close to the new Lotus, and creating a copy would have been hugely expensive. The Lotus 88 was the first ever Formula One car to use a completely carbon fibre and Kevlar chassis, which was the only way to make it stiff enough for the twin chassis concept to work. No other team had the ability to quickly build a carbon fibre chassis, except for McLaren, which would launch its outsourced carbon fibre MP4 later in 1981. An idea of just how soundly the Lotus 88 would have beaten the competition can be gathered from the events which happened later in the season. Inspired by the Lotus 88, Brabham designer Gordon Murray introduced a supplementary hydropneumatic system to the BT49, which allowed it to sink to the ground when out on the track, effectively a crude copy of what Chapman had achieved with the Lotus 88. Other teams copied Murray's solution, but the head start Brabham achieved helped Nelson Piquet clinch the title from Carlos Reutemann's Williams. And De Angelis? Well, instead of romping to the title in a car which potentially had a bigger performance advantage than the Lotus 79 had had in 1978, he was forced to drive the hurriedly hacked together Lotus 87, which was overweight, inefficient and slow. Nevertheless, De Angelis placed in the top 6 8 times, with a best result of 4th place at Monza to finish a notable 8th place in the World Championship. 1982 should have been a better season. Lotus had produced a tidy car and expected to be competitive. However, 1988 was to be a chaotic season, with cars' competitiveness changing massively from one weekend to the next, as well as being the first year when turbocharged cars stamped their mark on Formula One. 11 drivers were to win across the 16 races. Pironi, who should have been champion, missed the last 5 races after a terrible accident at Hockenheim. The season turned out to be a strange one for De Angelis. He scored his first points in the 3rd race at Long Beach after having taken up the wrong slot on the grid and then having to manoeuvre into the right one whilst the field was forming up. Chaos ensued, including teammate Nigel Mansell starting the race in reverse gear. But once things had settled down, De Angelis drove a measured race to claim 5th place. Points followed in 4 of the next 6 races, but it was when the field reached Austria that the Italian and his Lotus really found the groove. Having qualified in 7th, De Angelis benefited from Patrick Tournbay's Ferrari suffering a puncture and from planned pit stops by the Brabham team to rise to 2nd place behind Alain Prost's Renault. When the French car came to a grinding halt in flames, De Angelis was through and into the lead, with only one problem to worry about: Keke Rosberg's Williams, which was closing in fast. When Prost retired, Rosberg was 4 seconds behind, with 5 laps remaining. The Williams closed at nearly a second a lap. 1.6 seconds behind at the start of the final lap, and with the benefit of a slipstream on the long straights, Rosberg was on the Lotus's tail with half a lap to go. All around the final series of corners, the Williams darted around, but De Angelis kept things clean and smooth, held the inside line through the long final Jochen Rindt curve, and edged out his friend by 0.05 of a second to claim his first win and a historic 150th triumph for the Ford Cosworth DFV engine. After the absolute chaos of the 1982 season, the FIA made further rule changes which would make the cars slower and safer. Flat bottoms would replace ground effects. This was expected to allow Cosworth-powered teams to remain competitive with the turbos of Ferrari, Renault and BMW. For 1983, Lotus would be switching to turbo engines though, with a new deal to use Renault's engines in its new cars. Missing, however, was Colin Chapman, the heart and soul of the team, who had suffered a fatal heart attack at the end of 1982. The team would be led by Peter Waugh, and importantly, during the season, Lotus would acquire the services of Gérard Ducarouge as chief engineer, after the talented Frenchman was bizarrely dismissed by Alfa Romeo after a car was disqualified for being found to have an empty fire extinguisher. De Angelis drove the new Renault-powered car all season, and was plagued with bad luck. In Rio, he was disqualified after his engine failed on the warm-up lap, and he switched to the Cosworth-powered spare car, a move that was deemed illegal. At Long Beach and Paul Ricard, he claimed 5th place on the grid, but retired with handling problems in the former and electrical issues in the latter. He wouldn't even reach the finish line until the Belgian Grand Prix, and didn't score points until the Italian Grand Prix in September, despite regularly qualifying in the top 5. He had his best race at the hastily arranged European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, qualifying on pole for the first time in his career, and then shadowing Riccardo Patrese Brabham for the first 10 laps after the latter beat him off the line and into the first corner. For 10 laps, the two Italians circulated close together, before De Angelis started hearing worrying sounds from his engine. Figuring that this might be his only chance to lead a Grand Prix in 1983, he tried an enormously optimistic pass on Patrese going into Surtees corner, with the two cars inevitably colliding, and Piquet going past into the lead. Although De Angelis got the Lotus going again, it lasted just 2 more laps before the engine failed. When engine failure ended his final race of the season in South Africa, it neatly bookended what had been a disappointing season. In 1984, things were to swing the other way. De Angelis and the Lotus were reliable and quick, but not quite quick enough to take the battle to the dominant McLaren tag Porsches of Niki Lauda and Alain Prost. At the opening race of the season, De Angelis claimed pole position, and in a long hot race followed Prost and Keke Rosberg's Williams home to finish in third place. In South Africa, he qualified and finished in seventh place, this being the only time he failed to score points in the first 10 races of the season. During that time, he finished on the podium in Belgium, Detroit and Dallas. When the teams reached the 11th round in Germany, De Angelis was in third place in the World Championship, just 8 points behind leader Alain Prost. After the McLarens, the Lotus De Angelis combination was recognised as the fastest and most reliable on the grid. Lotus were faced with a dilemma. De Angelis was firmly in the championship battle, but if he couldn't beat the McLarens in a straight fight, then the title was out of reach. The team decided to throw caution, and its impeccable reliability record, to the wind, and to turn the turbo up on the Renault engine in order to give De Angelis the power he needed to take the fight to Prost and Lauda. In Germany, De Angelis qualified on the front row alongside Prost. Qualifying hadn't been the problem though. This was the era of qualifying setups and engines being changed between qualifying and the race. De Angelis had outqualified one or both of the McLarens at 8 of the 11 races thus far. At Hockenheim, with the Renault engine running at full power, De Angelis darted past Prost and into the lead, and it looked like we might actually have a three-way fight for the championship on the cards. On lap 7, though, that was no longer the case, as the Renault engine launched itself on one of its turbos, and De Angelis was out of the race. Prost and Lauda finished first and second, significantly damaging Elio's championship chances. In the following race in Austria, De Angelis split the McLarens, qualifying in third place. However, a blown engine ended his race, and oil he spilt at the Jochen Rindt curve was to cause Prost to spin off and out of the race too. Lauda clinched victory, taking the championship lead and moving 21.5 points clear of De Angelis, with just 4 races remaining. In Holland, De Angelis qualified third, directly behind poleman Prost and 3 places ahead of Lauda, knowing only a victory would keep him in the title battle. Prost won from Lauda, whilst De Angelis was unable to pass a belligerent Mansell for third place, his teammate feeling no need to support him after having been dumped for Lotus for 1985. At Monza, De Angelis split the 2 McLarens in qualifying, but gearbox failure ended his race after just 14 laps. A 5th place finish in the final race in Portugal meant that De Angelis secured third place in the World Championship behind Lauda and Prost. For Lotus, the decision to chase speed at the expense of reliability for the final 6 rounds of the season had been a gamble worth taking. If they had played safe and De Angelis had maintained his 2.65 points per race average, he would have still finished third in the title battle, albeit slightly closer to runner-up Prost. With 1984 considered a resounding success for team and driver, 1985 should have been an opportunity to take another step forward. However, the reason for Mansell's departure was the signing of Ayrton Senna to the Lotus team, and Peter Waugh had no doubts about who was his number 1 driver now. For the season opener in Brazil then, it was something of a surprise to see De Angelis quicker than Senna in qualifying. De Angelis had claimed provisional pole on Friday, with a lap 7/10 faster than his teammate, who was second. Mechanical issues meant that De Angelis missed out on Saturday's faster qualifying session, but even so, his Friday lap was fast enough for third place on the grid and ahead of the Brazilian, although Elio rued the problems which had almost certainly robbed him of back-to-back pole positions in Rio. It was a position he maintained to the end of the race, even if he did go backwards as the McLarens came storming past. In Portugal for the second race, Senna asserted his authority and validated his claim to be the team's number 1 driver with an astonishing lap to claim pole position, and then an astonishing drive in the rain to win his first Grand Prix. De Angelis qualified and finished in 4th place. The San Marino Grand Prix was to be one of the most exciting and interesting races of the year. De Angelis qualified third, while Senna once more qualified on pole. De Angelis would then go on to claim victory without ever leading the race. From the start, De Angelis passed Rosberg and tucked in behind Senna, the 2 Lotuses running first and second and pulling away from the field. But by lap 10, De Angelis had started to suffer from turbo problems, which was causing him a loss of power, and he started to drop back from Senna and was passed by those running behind. This loss of power was to be crucial for the race result. Alain Prost moved into second place and began to catch and then battle Senna, but after several laps of unsuccessful forays, dropped back to conserve fuel. Lauda had briefly passed De Angelis for third, but Elio had gone back past as Lauda struggled with a difficult gearbox. Then, from nowhere, literally in this case as he had qualified back in 15th, Stefan Johansson began to charge through the field in his Ferrari, passing Lauda for fourth, and then De Angelis, who was unable to respond with his power issues. Soon the Ferrari was past Prost too, and Johansson, in just his second race for Ferrari, was on his way to becoming a legend. Then, with 3 laps to go, Senna's car coughed and spluttered and rolled to a halt, out of fuel. Fuel restrictions were the order of the day in 1985, and San Marino, with its hard acceleration, long run to the first corner at Tosa, and uphill drag from Acqua Minerale to Variante Alta, sucked that fuel down harder than any other circuit. Senna was out, and Johansson cruised past, leading a Grand Prix in Italy in a Ferrari. The crowd roared its approval, but within seconds was silenced. Johansson too had run dry and was out of the race. Prost cruised past into the lead with De Angelis behind, the only 2 cars on the lead lap. Prost, having been conservative with his fuel, crossed the finish line in first place, with De Angelis, his Lotus having sipped at its fuel allowance thanks to its power problem, coming home in second place. Thierry Boutsen finished third, despite his arrows running out of fuel on the final lap. Then, things got messy. Prost's McLaren ran out of fuel on the slowing down lap and never made it back to the pits. And when the stewards finally retrieved it and completed scrutineering, the car was found to be 4 kilograms under the weight limit. There was no option but to disqualify Prost, which meant that De Angelis, power problem and all, had won his second Grand Prix. For the first time in his career, he was now leading the World Championship. At Monaco, De Angelis qualified a disappointing 9th, while Senna claimed his 3rd consecutive pole position. But an expertly driven and very aggressive race saw Elio climb to 3rd place by the checkered flag, retaining his championship lead over Prost and Alboreto, who had finished 1st and 2nd. In Canada, De Angelis claimed his 1st pole position of the season and the final one of his career. On race day, fuel consumption concerns limited his performance and he finished in 5th place, dropping behind Alboreto and Prost in the championship battle. This brief spell would be the only time he led the title race in his career. In Detroit and France, De Angelis would again finish in 5th place, keeping him in the title battle, while Senna had yet to add to the points he had claimed with his Portuguese victory. It really seemed that De Angelis' knack of bringing the car home was going to once more see him keep the Lotus in title contention. 5th places also followed in Austria and Holland, then a 6th place in Italy. But Prost and the McLaren team had found another gear and was now running away with the championship. Senna too was now racking up the results, and when he won in Belgium and De Angelis retired with engine problems, the Brazilian took over 3rd place in the championship from his teammate. With mechanical problems and a disqualification, meaning he scored no more points that season, De Angelis eventually finished 5th in the championship, 1 place and 5 points behind Senna. Lotus's decision to focus its energies on Senna had left De Angelis feeling sidelined. Rather than play second fiddle to the Brazilian, De Angelis decided to try his luck elsewhere in 1986 and came to an agreement with the team to replace Nelson Piquet at Brabham, one of the decade's front-running teams to that point. 1986 was the year of the Brabham BT55, Gordon Murray's experimental skateboard design, which was much lower than other cars, required an almost flat driving position of the driver, and had its BMW 4-cylinder engine canted over at an extreme angle in order to reduce aerodynamic drag as much as possible. The car was difficult to drive, unpredictable on the track, and unreliable to boot, and De Angelis struggled with it more than new teammate Riccardo Patrese. After qualifying outside the top 10 in each of the first 3 races, and never looking competitive in a race, things took a turn for the worse in Monaco. Whilst Patrese claimed an impressive 6th place on the grid, De Angelis only just scraped into the field in 20th and last place, less than 1/10 of a second ahead of Piercarlo Ghinzani's aging Osella. When mechanical issues forced his retirement for the 3rd time, De Angelis was distraught. The team was due to undertake a lengthy testing session between the Monaco and Belgian Grand Prix, and Riccardo Patrese was slated to drive. Conscious of the struggles he was having with the BT55, Elio approached Riccardo and asked if he could drive at the test instead. His teammate agreed, and it was De Angelis who took over driving duties at the Paul Ricard circuit in France. On May 14th, on the second morning of testing, De Angelis was out on track alone. Coming past the pits and entering the near flat-out S-bend which followed the pit straight, an end plate detached from the rear wing, causing the car to lose downforce and be launched into a series of end-over-end rolls, bouncing over the trackside armco and coming to rest on the left of the circuit, upside down, and with Elio trapped in the car after the collapse of the roll hoop. This being the 1980s, there were almost no marshals at testing, and certainly no fast response emergency vehicle, fire truck or safety crew. As the car sat upside down with De Angelis trapped inside, it started smoking. Alan Jones and Alain Prost, who had just left the pit lane, were the first people on the scene, but despite getting some assistance from spectators and photographers, they were unable to right the car. The car was only carrying 4 gallons of fuel, but this was leaking through the fuel breather pipe, eventually reaching the superhot turbo, which caused it to ignite, resulting in a fireball. Mechanics from the Haas and McLaren team raced to the scene of the accident in road cars, bringing fire extinguishers to try and fight the fire, sadly without great effect. As the fire raged around the back of the car, De Angelis remained trapped in the cockpit, untouched by the flames, but now being starved of oxygen as the fire consumed it all. At some point, Elio suffered a heart attack brought on by asphyxiation. When a fire truck eventually arrived and extinguished the fire, De Angelis had no pulse, and his brain had been starved of oxygen for long enough to guarantee serious damage, even if he were to somehow survive. A young doctor on the scene as a spectator injected adrenaline, and De Angelis' heart was restarted. But the reprieve was temporary. He was transferred by helicopter to hospital, where he died that evening. The team was distraught. In a short time, De Angelis had become extremely popular with everyone at its Chessington base. The sport, too, was shocked by the senseless loss of life. Aside from a broken collarbone, De Angelis had been uninjured in what had been a massive accident. If the car had been righted before the fireball took hold, he would have likely been back in the cockpit within a matter of weeks. The lack of a requirement for any safety compliance at test sessions was shocking. Even the barest of support would have changed the outcome significantly. Even the test wasn't supposed to be taking at the high-speed Paul Ricard circuit. It had been originally planned for the much slower Dijon circuit and had been changed at the last minute. 13 years after the horrific and senseless death of Roger Williamson, in eerily similar circumstances, Formula One's lack of progress in safety measures was exposed for the world to see. It was a tragic and pointless death, which absolutely did not need to happen. Allowing an officially sanctioned test session to take place with only very limited marshalling and next to no medical support was borderline criminal. Even in 1986, it wouldn't have been acceptable at a Grand Prix weekend. It certainly shouldn't have been at a test session either. It's something I've said in several videos in the past. Greatness isn't measured in terms of trophies. Despite winning just 2 Grand Prix, De Angelis proved himself a great of Formula One in different ways. Yes, he was fast, but that speed also came with intelligence. He was a favourite amongst his engineers and mechanics. His technical feedback was excellent, and he treated his rivals with respect. It's impossible to imagine Elio driving someone off the road or weaving to keep someone behind. He was far too much of a sportsman in that respect. Out of the car, he was just as classy. Rivals were friends. Journalists respected, respect which was returned. He was a classically trained concert-level pianist who entertained other drivers during the 1982 South African drivers' strike with a demonstration of his mastery of the ivories. Elio had no enemies, only friends in Formula One, notably Keke Rosberg, whose decision to retire at the end of 1986 was at least partially motivated by De Angelis' death. De Angelis never dominated his era, never won a world championship, never took a car by the scruff of the neck and hustled it to a result. Instead, His driving was the embodiment of the classic piano player. His third place in the 1984 championship, every bit as impressive as several drivers' championship victories. Elio de Angelis, a good man first, an excellent driver second.